Once again, welcome to the Research Safari podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be sitting down with a Ugandan researcher, academician, entrepreneur, and author. His name is Dr. Godwin Anywar. Good day, Dr. Anywar. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Robertson. Good to meet you and happy to be here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. So for the members of the audience who may not know you, could you please present yourself?
Yes, my name is Godwin, Dr. Godwin Anywar. I'm a lecturer at Makerere University in the Department of Plant Sciences, Microbiology, and Biotechnology. And from the name, you can tell that I'm an expert in plants. I do a lot of work on medicinal plants and other plant species as well. That may not necessarily be medicinal, like poisonous plants.
Yeah. So why did you choose to work on medicinal plants? Where did the interest stem from?
Yeah, the interest in medicinal plants came from the fact that in our communities and in our surroundings, in our environment, we have lots of plants in our midst. And if you are very keen, many people actually use plants for managing different ailments from their day-to-day activities, from simple cuts to wounds to malaria. So there was this widespread use of medicinal plants all around us. But it didn't occur to me why people would still go to hospital and use so-called modern medicines when we have all these plants around us. Then upon further probing, I actually got to learn that about a quarter, actually slightly over a quarter of all the modern drugs used today are actually derived either directly or indirectly from medicinal plants and from other natural sources. So for me, that was very compelling evidence or a very compelling justification to venture into medicinal plants because of their potential to cure our diseases and to change the world.
All right, thank you. Now, for those who are listening to this who may not be scientists, if over a quarter of the drugs are made from the plants, why don't we use the plants directly? Why make the drugs? What's the purpose or the benefit of transforming those into drugs?
Actually, over 80% of the communities in developing countries still rely or still use traditional medicine, herbal medicine, or medicinal plants for their primary healthcare needs. And the process of taking these crude drugs and converting them into a modern medicine is actually very laborious. It is time-consuming and it is very, very costly. So it's actually estimated that on average, it takes 15 to 20 years to develop a modern medicine, modern drug from a herbal medicine. So there are various processes, various phases it has to go through, which involve testing for several things, including safety and toxicity, efficacy, what we call clinical trials. And this costs a lot of money. So perhaps that is one of the reasons why many of the traditional medicines or herbal medicines have actually not been developed into modern medicines. But also, I think if you look at it from the perspective of maybe Africans in their setting, there has simply been no need for doing this traditionally. I mean, if I can go and pick a leaf, a piece of bitter leaf when I have malaria, and I chew it and it helps me feel better, then there is really no need, there's no justification, there's nothing to push me to go and, try and have an improved version of better version of what I'm using, because it's actually doing for me what I want.
Yeah. But these days, it seems like herbalists are trying to move in that direction. So what's the cause for that? What's making them move in that direction of wanting to develop the drugs?
Yeah, the reason that they push for moving towards that direction is the reasons are multiple. Okay, one of the reasons is the regulations. I'll give an example of Uganda, the case of Uganda, but many of these things apply across not only Africa, but across the world. If you want your herbal product or your herbal medicine to get some kind of accreditation or certification, it has to fulfill certain requirements, both legal and both technical. So because of this, if I'm a herbalist and I want to get regulatory approval, certification, or whatever I may call it, I have to subject my product to those requirements, those guidelines. And they often entail testing the product, formulating it, and ensuring that it conforms to a certain standard. It involves standardizing. So because of these legal requirements, many herbalists are moving towards that direction. And there's also a belief that once you do this, you get acceptance, because it is actually a mark of prestige and a sign of confidence if an independent body can actually test your medicine and verify it and give you some kind of certification. So that builds confidence in the public. So many people that were not originally subjecting their herbal products to these processes are actually compelled to do so.
To do it now. I see.
Mm.
And earlier on, you said, so essentially, if up to 80% of the population still uses herbal medicines, growing up, did that affect you? Was that used in your family? What was your first introduction to herbal medicines?
Yeah, in some regions, the percentage is actually higher. In rural parts of Uganda, it is as high as 90%. So I was introduced to herbal medicine quite early on in my life. But I was not conscious about this, but when I would fall as a little child and get injured and get bruised, get wounds, get cuts, the first thing that my mother would apply to the wounds were different herbs, including blackjack, including aloe vera. And these herbs would actually make the wounds dry very quickly. And we know today from science that they actually have several advantages. They speed up the healing of wounds. The wound heals without forming, a lot of scar tissue. They have antibacterial properties and the like. So I got introduced to herbs quite early on. I actually remember at one point when, I don't remember whether it was measles, but as a child, I developed some terrible skin rash and there was a lot of itching. And my mother and my grandmother actually used some herbs to wash me. And the next day, all rash, the rash and the swellings had actually dried and the itching had gone. So it was quite early on in life.
Yeah. Okay, I see. So that's when you were first introduced to herbal medicines. Now, did that have any effect on the first plants you decided to study? Or was there something else that brought you back to the field? And what was the first plant you really decided to put your mind to and study?
Yeah, of course, that incident did influence because I was only a child anyway, and it didn't really influence or affect my choice. When I was growing up, all I wanted to do was to become a doctor, a medical doctor or a physician, because my father was actually a doctor, he was a surgeon. But later on, at university, I failed to make it to the medical school because I missed the cutoff points. It was very competitive. So rather than, well, there were different options that were floated around, but because the university in which I am, Akere University, is very highly prestigious, and it's actually the best in the country and among the best in Africa. It's actually, I think, ranked, depending on which ranking you look at, but I think it's currently ranked number 3 on the continent. So there are options of trying medicine in other universities, but the pressure to enter Makerere was very high, and most people would not exchange it for anything else. So when before I joined, there was a professor that gave a talk on medicinal plants, and that opened up my mind. I got to see, to appreciate, and to understand the importance of medicinal plants in the history of medicine and the different things medicinal plants have done. And that was a turning point for me. I picked interest and I began, reading and studying about different medicinal plants, and the interest just kept growing and growing.
And so eventually what was your first project on?
Yeah, my first project was on, there's a plant called Aframomum, and there are different species of Aframomum in Africa. There are species that are common in East Africa, and then there are those that are common in West Africa. The ones in West Africa, especially what they call the grains of paradise, have been previously studied. There was a lot of research on them, and there's actually a lot of scientific information, evidence to support the different claims towards these grains of paradise. So they are related species in East Africa, and it actually occurred to me that one of the common species, Aframomum angustifolium, was actually one of the neglected wild food plants. Seasonally, or occasionally when in season, you would see young boys hawking the fruit of this plant along the streets, and many people would actually flock to buy it, especially those that had memories of this plant during their childhood and wanted to consume it, because most of the habitat in which it grows in swampy areas, and most of the habitats were actually being destroyed, and it was not easy to get. So when I saw people, buying it and eating it, I picked interest in investigating its properties. Yeah, so I decided to look at the potential health benefits of consuming this plant. Remember, it was being used as a fruit. Yeah. Traditionally, it's consumed as a fruit, as a snack, actually, by young children or by people in the garden while working the fields, and you need something quick to snack on. It was one of the go-to plants. So I thought I might investigate its potential health benefits since there was no study on that. So I knew it was nutritious, rich in vitamins and all these other things. So I went ahead to find out if it has any antibacterial and antifungal properties, and to find out what we call the phytochemical composition of this plant. So I did some studies, and interestingly, I was able to show that this plant actually has some antibacterial properties against some selected bacterial species.
Yeah.
When we're comparing it with the modern medicine. Of course, the modern medicine was more potent, but the fact that this plant that is being consumed as a food also has some antibacterial and antifungal properties, very interesting to me. And so basically it was able to inhibit to some extent the growth of these bacteria. I used two species of bacteria, E. coli and staph. And then I went ahead to find out what this plant contains, the phytochemical composition. And indeed, it had a very rich diversity of these, what we call the secondary metabolites, the compounds which are responsible for the medicinal effects we see in plants. So that was my starting point with on research in medicinal plants. And for me, it was one of the things that made it particularly compelling was when I look at what the father of modern medicine said several years ago, Hippocrates, he actually said that let thy food be thy medicine and thy medicine be thy food. So if we should make every effort to eat things that are not only nourishing our bodies, but are also offering some health benefits. And there are different plants that have this unique property of nourishing the body, but also helping in the treatment and prevention of disease.
Yeah, that's right. That would be the best. That would be perfect. The best of both worlds if you can eat good food and at the same time get better. I think nobody is going to say no to that. So in that sense, I think the work you do is extremely important, especially in our countries where people already like to use herbal drugs and herbal medicines. Now, for example, when you were working with this plant, I'm assuming there was a bit of field work that had to be done. You had to go out there, find out the plant and all that. Did you need to work with people in communities to help pinpoint where the plants were? Or was it, or were you working with people who already had a general idea? Or was it that at the university you had a section where they were already growing the plants? How did things happen?
Yeah, that's a very good question, very important question. So the research we do involves working with people, and the people, excuse me, who could be herbalists or traditional medicine practitioners are actually very important stakeholders because they are the custodians of this traditional knowledge. So for us to get access to this knowledge, we have to go to the people that actually have this knowledge. And this knowledge has been passed on orally for generations upon generations. So it's important to work with these people because without them, you'll not have access to this information. One West African poet famously said that once an elder, once an old man, in the village dies, an entire library is burned down. So that goes on to emphasize the wealth of knowledge these people have. So we have to interact with them, to tap into their wisdom, into their knowledge, to get this knowledge and actually document it. Because like I mentioned earlier on, this knowledge has traditionally been passed on orally. There was no culture of writing things. So in the process, many things have been lost. So when we work with these people, we try and document as much as possible of what they are using, the practices, the plant species. And then after documenting and understanding what or which plant species are used and how they are used, we can then go ahead to conduct some scientific studies to actually verify the claims they are making. So we have always worked with traditional communities because they are the custodians of this knowledge.
All right. And how are you able to build trust with these traditional medicinal practitioners? Because, for example, I've had stories in the past of individuals who have gone in the field. They go to a certain person, they ask about a particular, how do I put it, a particular concoction that they use. They get a recipe, but then when they send someone that's maybe closer to that person, they get a different recipe. So how do you build trust in order to get to a level where they actually believe in you enough to tell you the correct thing?
Yeah, that's a very good question again. I must say it's not easy winning the confidence and the trust of these people, because the information or the knowledge we are trying to get from them is actually very sensitive, and it's a source of their livelihood. For some of them, they depend on this, to make money, because they will treat clients, the clients will pay, and their livelihood depends on this. But it's very important to be very patient with them and build trust and build a rapport. It's a process. It takes time, and it has to be handled very delicately and very carefully. So for this to work, the herbalists need to be, they need to understand the benefits they are going to get from this kind of engagement. It may not be easy to see, but it takes time. And once you sit them down and you explain what you are doing, or what you intend to do, some of them will come through and they'll understand what this is all about. So there may not be many, but you'll get a few that are trusted. Now, for example, if we were to sit down with some of the herbalists, we are going to explain that if we are aware, or if we get to learn of which plant species you're using for treating a certain condition, we are able to furnish you with scientific information that would actually be very helpful in the long run. And this information, because we also have to make them aware that some of the plant species they are using are actually not confined or limited to a particular region. For instance, plant species that may be used for treating malaria in Uganda, but you find them being used for treating the same condition or other conditions in other parts of the world. So there is an exchange of information. So if you get to learn what plants they are using, you can supply them with additional information which can be very helpful. There are cases where we have found herbalists using certain plants, and yet there is scientific evidence to suggest that some of these plant species are harmful. They are toxic or they are poisonous. So when we bring this to their attention, we are able to, interact. There's a dialogue. We exchange and we learn a lot. So if they see how they are going to benefit from this kind of arrangement, they are very willing to participate. And also when they furnish us with this information, we are able to test some of the plant species they are using, and we'll come to them and say, hey, look here, you use this plant for treating malaria, and we have tested and confirmed in the laboratory that this plant actually has some activity against the parasites, the malaria parasites. So it's a potential candidate,
Yeah.
Then armed with this information, they can actually take their products a notch higher. They can maybe go to the authorities, get certification and that kind of thing. So if they see some of these benefits, they will willingly participate. And that is what they have done.
I see. And staying on this part, have there been cases where some herbalists really helped you direct your research or help prevent you from making maybe an error that may have negatively affected your research if you had kept going in a particular direction?
Yeah, there are several examples where this has happened. Sometimes, for example, in the case of malaria, which is endemic, and we have high incidences of malaria in the country, there are lots of medicinal plants that people use for treating malaria. But with the help of herbalists, of course, you'll get to know all the medicinal plant species that are used. But because of resource limitations, you are not able to test. We are doing a review of medicinal plant species used for treating malaria in Uganda. And so far, we've come up with about 214 plant species and counting. The list is still growing. So, however endowed you are, you may not be able to test all these plant species, and it may not make economic sense, both scientific and economic sense, to test all these plant species. So there has to be a way of coming up with the most promising or the most suitable candidates to test. And the only way this can happen is with the help of the herbalists.
Yeah.
They will tell you which of these 200 plus plant species are the most important in their formulations or their remedies. We also have to understand one thing, that when the herbalists are preparing their medicines, they often mix different plant species and they mix them in certain proportions.
Yeah.
So when we are interacting them to find out which plant species they use, we are not necessarily getting the formula. They use this plant X, plant Y, they mix it with this in this, ratio. No, we are looking at the overall plant species, and because if we get into those specific details, we are making their secret knowledge available to the public, and that will deny them of their livelihood. So in such cases, they help you to focus on which plant species would be the most important for the particular condition you're investigating. That helps. So you're able to select 2 or 3 of the most important plants with a justification, and you test them. And in many cases, when we have done this, we have actually found the plant species they have recommended to be very potent or very active. Then there are cases where they'll tell you, we use this plant, but it has to be used under certain conditions, or it has to be prepared in a certain way because it is toxic.
Yeah.
If certain measures are not put in place, it may cause more harm than good. Or we don't give this to pregnant women, we don't give this to children. And indeed, there are plant species they have mentioned, and we have tested and found them to be highly toxic in the lab. But the interesting thing is they continue using them. And when you try and probe a little further, you get to realize that they are using them in a very unique way.
Yeah.
The way they're using them or preparing them is not the same way they ordinarily prepare other formulations. For example, one of the plant species we have come across is called Antiaris toxicaria. Okay, that's the scientific name, Antiaris toxicaria. And from the name, you clearly see that this plant is toxic. But they have devised ways of detoxifying this plant, and some of the means include prolonged boiling. They boil it for over 6 hours or for over 12 hours. And that prolonged boiling, the process ends up, detoxifying or denaturing some of these toxic compounds. But there are other things they do. They will mix or they'll prepare some of these toxic plant species with other plant species, which we believe neutralize the toxicity and make the plants, safer to use. Because sometimes a plant may be poisonous, but it may carry a certain beneficial effect. So if we can knock off or suppress the toxicity and enhance the potential therapeutic benefits, we can benefit a lot from this. And this has been done scientifically. So what they are telling us has actually been proven scientific. We have poisonous plants that have been used, for example, during hunting as hunting poisons cultures, and they have yielded modern drugs, which we are using to date.
Yeah, and I believe what you shared is actually, so it shows that over time, they've been able to essentially make determinations of their own, like through some sort of, I'll say, sort of a scientific process, in a sense, because these are things that have been tested over a very long period of time. And so they've gotten to a level where they know what to do and what not to do in order to be able to go around certain problems that they may, or certain roadblocks that they may hit. I think one of the things that you also shared in your answer is one thing is important also when it comes to building trust is you said you don't necessarily ask them for the recipe. And I think that's also one thing that can help build trust, because they realize, okay, this person is not asking me exactly for how I make my product, but it's just asking me for a general idea so that they can also help me in one way or another. So I think that's also a very important step, or a very important area or way to go through it. Yeah. Now, when you are done with the research, and let's say you want to share the information, I know, of course, you have to share it with the herbalists. I'm sure that's something you already do. How about sharing it with the general public? Is that something that's done in one way or another?
Yeah. So, dissemination of research findings is very, very important, because it's the only way you can get the world out there to know what you are doing or what you have found out. And when we are disseminating the research findings, there are different categories of people that we target, and each of them have different needs. So when we are disseminating to the herbalists, for example, the methods we use or the way we share this information is not the same way we share it with the scientific community. With the herbalists, in most cases, they are overwhelmingly illiterate. They are not going to school, so they can't read and write. So you have to find ways of presenting this information in a way that is easily accessible to them. And for me, one of the best ways of doing this, an approach we have tried out before, is doing videos. We have done what are called video articles. So you basically film the research process from the beginning to the end. Of course, not continuously, but some critical moments.
Yeah.
For example, if you are working with herbalists, you may film sections where you're interviewing the herbalists, where they are showing you which plants they use, where they're showing you how they harvest these plants, how they boil them, you know. So some of those key portions can be captured.
Yeah.
When you take this plant to the lab, what happens? How do you prepare it? How do you do the extractions? How do you test against different things? For example, if you are giving the plant extracts to animals, how do you administer? What kind of animals? If you are drawing blood from humans, you know, so the process is well documented and there are visuals. And this is accompanied by a narrative explaining what is happening with subtitles in maybe the respective languages, or you can do a voiceover in the local language so that the herbalists are understanding what's happening. So when they see themselves on video and they are part of this scientific process, it enhances the research. They get to appreciate what is happening and they can really understand it and get immersed and be a part of the scientific process. They feel appreciated and they feel important because they are contributing towards a noble cause. But of course, to the scientific community, traditionally we use, maybe during conferences, you go and present a paper, and then later on the work is published in a scientific paper with all the scientific jargon and terms, so that anyone who wants to read about this work can find it, can easily access it, both in soft form and in hard form, and they can easily refer to it.
Yeah.
And then if the work has maybe serious policy implications and you want to target policymakers, for example, you could do policy briefs targeting perhaps members of parliament or other policy makers. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And still on this topic of dissemination, if this information gets to, let's say, a general public, is there ever a scare that, even if it's small, that if they get information that a certain plant is can help cure diseases, that they go and try by themselves without necessarily going through proper routes? How do we try to mitigate that aspect of things?
Yeah, that's you raise a very, very critical point there. Normally, when we are publishing this information, we add disclaimers indicating that expert advice or expert opinion should be sought before using some of these plants. They should not be used, without seeking the expertise of someone who understands or knows about these herbs. Of course, we also say we won't be held responsible for anything that may happen after using these plants, because what happens in many cases, if I can give example, I may tell you that a certain plant X, maybe moringa in your backyard, is used for treating malaria. And without even asking me how it is used, without asking me which part is used, you quickly rush to your backyard because you have a moringa tree and you have a sick child, and you pick maybe the leaves in whichever quantity you think is right, you administer to the child, and God forbid something terrible happens to the child. So we often caution people to be very careful when using these plant species, because it's not sufficient for me to tell you that a particular plant is used for treating malaria without telling you which part is used, without telling you what quantities, without telling you how it should be harvested, without telling you how it should be prepared, you know. Some plants are simply boiled and then maybe you inhale the steam, or they are applied topically on the skin, on the surface, and they are not meant to go in, you know. But because you do not seek out clarity, you end up messing up.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we advise and caution people to be very careful and also take the opinions of the experts very seriously. For example, this toxic plant species I was talking about, if the herbalist will, some herbalists were telling us that they clearly don't give those plants to pregnant women. But even when they're giving them to healthy people, they would give them in very small quantities, and they would often mix them with other herbs.
Yeah.
So context is very important. If you use the herbs without knowing the context, you may get yourself in problems.
Yeah, because even in my case, I remember it's a long time ago, but it was something as simple as lemongrass. My mother used to make a lot of lemongrass at home. And so one day I decided I was going to try to make it myself. I made it, but it seems I put too much and I let it boil for too long. Weirdly enough, it started giving me headaches. But for some reason, the first time I didn't believe it was a lemongrass. I thought maybe it was something else that I had taken. I did the same thing a second time and I got the exact same result. So even with something that seems maybe as inoffensive as lemongrass, if you do things the wrong way, then it can really cause some problems. It can really cause issues. Yeah.
That's right.
And moving on a bit, one thing that I've been wondering, over the last couple weeks, I've been looking a bit into how they do things in this area in places like India. And it seems that over there, they've been able to sort of incorporate what they do into their medical system to some extent, where they have universities where they actually teach people how to do this. While reading about it, I even found that in Ghana, around in the 2000s, late 2000s, it seems that they created a department at KNUST that does something similar. Is there anything of that nature in Uganda yet, or is it something you're thinking about or not yet?
Yeah, it's true. Countries like India and China have really taken steps to advance, to modernize their traditional medicine, and you'll find it in hospitals, modern hospitals. You find it in pharmacies, and it has been formalized. You find it being taught in universities, and I think I want to commend Ghana because it's one of, if not the only country in Africa that has, you know, taken this stride where you have traditional medicine being taught formally at the university, and you graduate as a traditional medicine doctor, and I don't know, I'm not sure if it's happening now because I had a chat with a colleague, but they are posted to different government facilities.
Okay.
So just like you post a doctor to work in a certain hospital, you're also posting a traditional, not a traditional doctor, but someone who has trained in traditional medicine, and they can diagnose, they can treat, you know, they can prescribe, and the medicine is available in the health facility. Different countries may be at different levels. In Mali, they were able to test some herbal medicines used by traditional healers, and they formulated an anti-malarial herbal remedy that you can now find in pharmacies and drug shops, and doctors can prescribe it. Now, in my country, in Uganda, there have been some efforts by different institutions, but it's not really concerted, it's piecemeal. Different people are trying to do different things, like training people in different aspects of herbal medicine and issuing certificates and short courses and the like. But on the overall picture, in the grand scheme of things, we do not have, well, at the universities, yes, we have some course units being taught, some courses which are close, like Bachelor of Science in Ethnobotany and the like, but we do not have this concerted effort to have maybe traditional medicine practitioners formally trained at the university, and they can now start treating people in hospitals. We're still a long way from that. Another thing I learned, perhaps Ghana and Mali are at the forefront of this. In Mali, I understand even the medical students at university are required to offer a certain number of hours in traditional medicine. They have to understand, they have to be taught, to be trained in some aspects of traditional medicine, because the local people they'll be treating, the people they treat, the people who come to hospital are also using herbal medicine, or they have used herbal medicine and they have failed, or they are going to take the modern medicine and go back and use the herbal medicine. So for the doctors to understand the complete picture, they have to understand what traditional medicine is and how it works and what the belief systems behind it are. Yeah, so in Mali that is happening, in Uganda not quite.
All right. And so my last question, what do you envision as the future trajectory of research in unearthing Uganda's traditional medicinal secrets in ethnopharmacology? What do you see the future? What does it look like to you?
Yeah, the future is very bright. The future is promising. There has been, how should I put it? There has been a revitalization of the herbal medicine industry. Even people that were seemingly moving away from herbal medicine have now been drawn back. One of the reasons was the COVID-19 pandemic we had recently, when people were locked up at home and they were desperate, they didn't know what to use, and different herbs and herbal remedies came up, and they proved to be helping people. In particular, there was one product called, the inventor called it Covidex, and it was basically a mixture of different local herbs. And people are giving testimonies of how it helped them when they were on their deathbeds during the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown. So there's been that confidence, the rebuilding of trust. Even those that didn't believe in herbal medicine initially are now turning to herbal medicine. The industry is growing. And the future is very bright. The future is very bright. We had a law recently passed, and that is going to help streamline the process and the practice. And I think this is very key. This is very instrumental, and it will ensure that herbal medicine moves forward in Uganda.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. And do you have any last words, anything that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, perhaps I'll reiterate the point I mentioned earlier, the words of Hippocrates, that let thy food be thy medicine and thy medicine be their food. So we have plenty of local, indigenous, traditional foods that can help in doing this. So we should return to some of these plants we had neglected, we had abandoned, or we thought we were not important, in preference for the modern conventional foods. So the foods that have been consumed by our forefathers actually have a lot to offer. So let's turn back to nature. Let's turn back to these foods to make us healthy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to us today. Dear listeners, you heard it here. Let's turn back to nature and let's make sure that what we eat also helps us live better, more healthy lives. As usual, if you're a researcher out there working on plants and you want to expand the impact of your research, you're welcome to contact us in order to be able to a future guest on the podcast. We'll be happy to have you and to help you spread whatever message you have to share with people out there. In our next episode, we'll of course delve deeper into the riches of Africa's biodiversity, talk more about plants and how they can be used to make us healthier. Thanks a lot and see you next time to talk more ethnopharmacology. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.